Brother Joe Fordham will be speaking to us this morning. His subject is the signs of the times, and he does not have a specific reading for us, so we'll turn our attention now to Brother Joe.
Thank you. Good morning. I have given this first part of this, this is on now, given the first part of this exhortation, actually, I think it was close to Passover, and today is what day on the Jewish calendar? That's the Day of Atonement. Now, they celebrated it yesterday, but a lot of people feel like it was off, and actually, it started at sundown last night through today is the Day of Atonement. So, as you know, it was the day, one day a year, that the high priest would go into the holiest of holies and offer sacrifice for the whole people so that they, as a nation, could be redeemed. It was a time when they could be cleansed. Now, in the last session, we talked about all the feasts and how they corresponded to the life of Christ and his life and his time when he was first appeared and when he's going to appear again. So we talked about the fact that the Passover was equated with Christ's crucifixion, that the unleavened bread, which is the feast of that starts right after Passover, was his time when he was buried in the ground, that the first fruits was when he was resurrected, and the day of Pentecost. So those three go together in the spring, and there's 50 days after that is the day of Pentecost, which was in the middle of the summer. That indicated the growth of the church in the Gentiles, which is where we are right now. The three fall feasts are what we're looking for when Christ returns. So it starts with the Feast of Trumpets, and it starts on the crescent of the new moon. On the Jewish calendar, it's very unspecific as to when that is. They sort of have to wait and watch for it, like we are waiting and watching for Christ's return. And we equated that one through a lot of different scriptural evidence to the resurrection. So that date has already passed us. Today, I think it's 10 days after that, was the Day of Atonement, which is where we are. And then after that was the Feast of Booths. So the Day of Atonement, I thought, was really well suited to the day of judgment for the wicked and the day of mercy for those who are raised in Christ and for those who are still left alive. And then the beautiful thing about the Feast of Booths, when you read in Zechariah, it will continue on in history all through the millennial age, is when God is dwelling with mankind. And it's also the marriage supper of the Lamb. So you've got both of those things put together. So you've got 3 spring feasts, 3 fall feasts, the one in the middle of the day of Pentecost. It fits perfectly with the menorah if it gets 7 candles. And so that's what we're looking at with this is, so now after we've examined those things, what are the signs of the times for us? So, I don't know how to turn this on there. So what could happen this year is sort of the next question. We've got 3 months left of this year. There isn't much time left. And then next year we know is a very significant year. It'll be the 70th, I believe, for the nation of Israel, becoming a nation. And there'll be a lot of other ones to be looking forward to too. The problem is that nobody's got their time perfect. The Gregorian calendar, we're at 2617 going into 2018. The Hebrew year just changed over from 5777 to 5778. So we are in a very significant time, both of these, but both of them are not perfect time-wise. It takes a lot of scholarship and a lot of work to actually figure out how many years have passed since the creation story. So the next one I wanted to talk about was The significance of this, that it's 7 obviously represents perfection, completion, and rest. God rested on the seventh day. The Sabbath year was every 7 years from Leviticus. The Jubilee year was after 7 cycles of 7 from Leviticus chapter 25. And by the way, it was announced on the Day of Atonement. The same day, they celebrated the year of Jubilee. And on that year, obviously, all lands returned back to the property owners. All debts were forgiven. All slaves were set free. So it was a year of redeeming everyone from under every crisis and oppression. There are 7s in Revelations. There's the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, the 7 vials, the 7 thunders, and there are 7 feasts. So all of this is very significant when we're looking at the next slide, which is the commemorations. 2017 is a huge year because it was 170 years ago. In 1847, that Dr. Thomas sort of discovered the truth, and it was got its legs in the next year after that, but it was exactly 170 years ago this year. In 1897, 120 years ago, Theodor Herzl founded the first Zionist Congress. And we know that that's significant to us also because the days shall be 120 years, and 120 years were given to repent and to build the ark before the door was shut. And that's from Genesis chapter 6, verse 3. In 1917, after World War I, or during World War I, was the Balfour Declaration under the General Allenby. Britain would free Jerusalem from under Turkish power. So that was very powerful because everybody thinks that World War I was pointless. It wasn't. God was reshaping the earth every single time. And the significance of that is great for us because it had been under Ottoman rule for 500 years before. It was broken up, and basically there were 2 surveyors, one French, one British, who carved up the Middle East, surveyed it, and turned it into all the states that we see today. So when you hear people say, oh, those problems have been going on since the beginning of time, I'm like, you're not correct. It started from 1917 going forward because the Jews were not living in the land, or very few of them were living in the land before that. So the Balfour Declaration changed the whole map of the Middle East to what we see today, and that was sort of the fulfillment of the budding of all the trees. The budding of the fig tree comes next, which is in 1947-48, which is 70 years ago. Not only were the Dead Sea Scrolls found, but the UN voted on Israel becoming a nation. And in Luke chapter 21, verse 32, it says, this generation will not pass away. Well, that's the World War II generation. Are we seeing the World War II generation pass away? Very fast. It's up to like 350 a day that are going. So we're running out, just like, people who fought in the Civil War mostly had died out by the 1920s, 1930s. It's happening again where this generation is petering out to almost nothing. Then 50 years ago was the 6-Day War when Israel recaptured East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the whole Sinai Peninsula. And they defeated the entire Air Force and most of the army of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, and many other nations. They were just completely wiped out. So we have a lot of commemorations, 170, 120, 170, 50, that we're all commemorating within this year. So there's a lot of significance to where we are right now. What's interesting is the Sanhedrin revives 2,000-year-old blessing for counting the Jubilee year. The Sanhedrin, the traditional power of legal counsel and court in Judaism, has been recently reformed, formed in Israel. The Sanhedrin ruled that in the year 5776, criteria had been met once again to be counting the Jubilee period. So they determined that enough people were back in the land to start counting again. Rabbi Hillel Weiss, the spokesman for the Sanhedrin, explained the breaking news to Israel that the Sanhedrin had ruled that we are now clearly in the prophetic third inheritance of the land, the first being by Joshua, the second after the Babylonian exile. So it's interesting that even they have recognized that they came into the land with Joshua and conquered it, Then they were taken out to Babylon, and they had to reconquer the land again after the Babylonian exile. And they were removed in 70 AD. And since 1948, this is the third time they have occupied the land. Also, it has been exactly one complete Jubilee cycle since the Six-Day War and the unification of Jerusalem. Had the Jubilee cycle not been interrupted 2,000 years ago by the diaspora, the first year of the ongoing Jubilee cycle would have been in 1967, the year Jerusalem was unified, and once again last year when the Sanhedrin reinstituted the Jubilee. So you can even see that they are starting to see this is an important thing we need to start reinstituting and start doing again. They're not doing it according to the law. They're observing the Jubilee, but they're not canceling debt. They're not returning land to whom they used to, or giving the land its rest. But at least it's being recognized. On the Jubilee year, they consecrated the 50th year and proclaimed liberty throughout the land and its inhabitants. It shall be a year of Jubilee for you, when each of you shall return his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. From creation to now is 120 Jubilee periods. From Christ is 40 Jubilee periods. 40 is used to multiple times in the Bible to signify a judgmental period. 18th year of King Josiah's reign, he kept the Passover, and we're going to look at that next as an example of what happened from the Passover forward, even though it was not specific to the Jubilee. But 50 years later, that very day, Hezekiah saw the vision that was completed in the temple for its use. So that's the 50-year period we're talking about, and you'll see it on the next slide. This is from Brother Cowie's work. Basically, you have the 18th year of Josiah when he has a great Passover, and then you have 30 years until after Jehoiakim, there's the fall of Jerusalem, and there's a 20-year period, and then you have Hezekiah seeing the temple opened. And that's just a significance of the 50-year period we were talking about related to the Jubilee. Also, we see the same kind of timeline being set up when Christ returns. So the yellow bar on your left-hand side is the return of Christ and the resurrection, then the judgment, and then the marriage supper of the Lamb is the first sort of 10 years. Then you have Yahweh Sabbath manifested in power for 40 years, but not unseen by the world. Elijah's mission to the scattered Jewry, the second regathering of Israel. So all the Jews and all the nations will hopefully be regathered in that time period. The Arabs, or the enemies of Israel, will be subdued, and they'll be smiting and healing in Egypt. Judah saved and settled in the land. Gog buried, and the land cleansed and divided. And then you have the temple being rebuilt sort of at the end of that, and Christ's universal rule over all the nations. So this is a guess from an astute brother, but you can make up your own timeline after looking at it and see what you come up with. This is what he came up with. I think it's interesting to see that from his return to establishing his kingdom might be a Jubilee period as well, because it's going to take time to subdue all the nations of the earth. This is another brother who sort of points to the same thing. This is Brother Neville Clark. He shows sort of the same thing, that there's the 10-year period after Christ's return of judgment and marriage, the marriage supper of the Lamb, and then there's the harvest of the earth, and then the fall of Rome, and 30 years of basically conquering the rest of the world, and then the rejoicing of the saints. These are all speculative. They're close in their mirroring of what might happen in the near future. In the Pattern of the End Times, this is another one by Jonathan Bowen. It talks about the 50 Jubilee period and what's going on and the sort of things we can expect to see. Again, it starts with the resurrection and the judgment, and then talks about the march of the rainbowed angel conquering the other lands, and the other nations making war with the Lamb. And then finally, once that's all over with, then you would have basically 2067, the temple being constructed or being finished by that time. So, bless you. And this is also the interesting part, is how fitting it would be for God to have grace on his people by sending his son in the year of grace and perfect completion, allowing the land to return to its original owner in a jubilee year, and how many amazing anniversaries. So we know in Leviticus, I think it's chapter 25, God says, the land belongs to me. You are just land occupiers until I return. So even to the Jews, he tells them he owns the land, and he is allowing them to live there, but he is the original owner. The following Hebrew year, 5778, which begins at the Feast of Trumpets in September of this year, would be the beginning of a new beginning. Can we last another Jubilee period before Christ's return? That's another question that sort of begs the idea of if it is for the elect's sake that Christ returns early, then this is a good reason for him to come. We have many in our midst that are dying or ill, leaving the truth, marrying outside the truth. Children are not accepting the truth, and not bringing believers in that we are leaving and dying. Influences of the world are creeping in from every side, and we are not as devoted to studying God's word as we once were. So it's interesting to me because there's always a time limit. I've always wanted to give an exhortation called the Christian Express Service. There was actually an article I found where there was a drive-through, and people could drive up in their car, get 15 minutes of exhortation and their communion, and drive out in 15 minutes or less, or your money back. I was like, we're almost there. We're getting there. But it's just amazing everywhere you go. The lengths of exhortations, the lengths of time that we spend studying to God is like, let's take it from an hour down to 50 minutes, and down to 45 minutes, down to a half an hour. Can you do it in 20 minutes? Can you do it in 15 minutes? And so it's getting more and more constricted. It's interesting to me because you read about pioneer brethren and what they used to do. They used to speak for 14 hours straight, in the 1900s and even in the 1800s, and people would listen. Now we're lucky if we get a half an hour of attentiveness. It's just a complete change from what was. I don't mean to be critical when I say that. It's just a big difference. And I've even had people tell me, well, the human here can only hear about 15 minutes worth of stuff, and then they're just toasted. I'm like, really? You can watch 4-hour football games. You can watch movies that last for 2 or 3 hours. So it's just a change that we're seeing everywhere. But the door is closing, and it's interesting that Noah was 600 years old when the floods came, and Christ is returning after 6,000 years. Noah's name means rest from Genesis chapter 5:29, and God's purpose for his people is to have rest. Noah was on the ark with the door shut for 7 days before the rain came. Christ returns, and we are taken before Armageddon and the destruction, from Thessalonians, from Luke, and Acts. And the phrase there is taken up or hidden, which I think is very interesting. Noah was on the ark for 1 year, and we will be with Christ with his bride for 1 year after the judgment, which we see from 3 different passages from Deuteronomy 24, Isaiah 26, and Joel chapter 2. So from Deuteronomy chapter 24, it says, and a man who is newly married, he shall not go out with the army or be liable for any other public duty. He shall be free at home 1 year to be happy with his wife whom he has taken. From Isaiah chapter 26, your dead shall live and their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to its dead. Come, my people, and enter the chambers, and shut my doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed by. So we know that God intends to hide us from the fury that's going to happen. Just like the Jews were spared in Egypt from the 10 plagues. They experienced the first 3, but the last 7, I believe, they were not subject to. And God, again, makes a distinction between his people and people who are not his throughout that whole time period. In Joel chapter 2, gather the people, consecrate the congregation, assembly, and the elders. Gather the children, even the nursing infants, and let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. So that's just a concept that we could be dwelling with the Lord for that year. The creation model of the timeline. We are right here. We're talking about the different millenniums in the last days, the Messiah's birth and returning, the creation. is all from 2 Peter, but do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord a day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day, which we're all familiar with. So the next one is the Revelations model timeline, and I wanted to give credit because I gave Amy Porterfield Legacy all my slides on the feast, and she went crazy with it. She added all this other content because she is so intent on looking for God's kingdom to return. And she listens to all these different brothers from around the world. And so together we sort of cooperatively put all this together. And Josh has given it down in Norfolk a couple times. But anyway, we've got the 7 seals and the time periods under it, 7 trumpets, the references and the dates under it, the vials, and in chapter 16, and that takes us from basically 1790 to the last days. And we are there, one verse away, basically, from the whole thing, which is the 7 thunders have not happened yet, but they will. So if you look at this, all the seals are complete, all the trumpets are complete. We are currently in the 6th vial from Revelation chapter 16. And verse 15, it says, behold, he comes as a thief. And verse 16 is the Armageddon. And then in chapter 16 also says, opens the 7 thunders of judgment between Armageddon and the millennium. So the 7th vial through the 7 thunders occurs during the kingdom age or after Christ's return. So basically, we are only one verse away from the end of this happening. So it's something for us to realize. This telescope of these visions from John on the island of Patmos in 90 AD collapsed sort of on top of each other, but we need to realize where we are in that revelationary vision. And Luke 21 gives us a lot as well, and I want to talk about some of those things. When you hear of wars and tumults and instability, great earthquakes in various places, famines and pestilence and diseases, terrors, great signs from the heavens, persecutions, betrayals, and hatred. So we have so much of this stuff going on. I know you're going to think I'm a little geekish, a little nerdish, but I'm going to say it anyway, so go ahead and judge away. I am very interested in geology because my dad was a chemist and geologist. So I have downloaded the app. I encourage you to as well. There's one on earthquakes that's stupendous because it gives you basically 0.3 on the Richter scale or higher around the world with a map. It shows you what the depth is, what the epicenter was, what time it hit, and what's going on. If you look at it week by week, it's just constantly increasing in frequency and also in impact of what's going on. The stuff that's happened in Mexico killed hundreds and hundreds of people, Haiti, Italy, it's just going on around the world continuously. And everybody's like, oh, it's always been like this. It's been an earthquake since the beginning of time. And I would say, yes. However, there has not been the frequency or the intensity that we have seen recently. It is increasing ever more, and it all has to do with plate tectonics. So it's an easy thing to understand from nature how God can make these things happen, because he talks about the great earthquake that's going to happen in Zechariah 14, and he says, as in the days of King Uzziah of Israel. Well, what's interesting is they sent back a bunch of seismologists with archaeologists to 6 different cities in Israel to examine the evidence. They said, look, here's the ruins from the earthquake from the time of King Uzziah. What would you put it on the Richter scale? And it was around a 8.2 on the Richter scale. So it's pretty intense. We know that there's a great fault line going right through Israel north-south from Mount Hebron, right through the Jordan to the Sea of Galilee, down the Jordan to the Dead Sea, and out through the Gulf of Aqaba. Makes perfect sense because the prophecy says he's going to heal the Dead Sea, Jerusalem's going to be raised up, the Mount of Olives is going to split in 2. All that makes perfect sense because it's already there. It's already ready to happen. So when these earthquakes happen, they're going to set off a worldwide chain, not only of earthquakes, but also of volcanic activity. And we have another app for volcanoes, and it's amazing because you can click on each one, find out every year that it's ever erupted, what's going on now, what the news is about it, what seismologists are saying about it, and that also, you can see for yourself, is increasing constantly. So what these are the birth pangs of the earth. And all of the pregnant women in here, or whoever ever been pregnant, will know when the contractions are getting closer. What does that mean? Anyone? type coffee? It means the baby is coming. What is the baby we're talking about? The birth of the dead of the earth. Okay? It's the rebirth of the dead of the earth. So these contractions are getting closer and closer together, and we're going to see this happening very soon. So the wars and tumults and instability we'll address next. But this also says there'll be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the seas and the waters. The roaring of the seas and the waters is the people. Is there a lot of unrest in the world right now? Yes, there is. What's going on in North Korea? What's going on in Iran? I mean, I hope you're staying on top of it in your own head. But they just tested missiles in Iran. They've been testing missiles in North Korea, and everybody's being bullies in a sandbox, and it's getting crazier and crazier what's going on in the world. The instability in the Middle East is continuing to escalate because we've got Iranian National Guards, we've got Hezbollah, we've got the new Syrian army, the Russians, all on Israel's north border. They're 5 miles away from Israel. And if you think that's insignificant, I was like, there's just so much prophecy to talk about what's going on. Iran wants to cut a path right through Iraq into Syria so they can bring their missiles right to Israel's doorstep. So it's just incredible. Also, I don't know if you know, if you get the Depka file, that's a fantastic news app you can get on your phone. And the Depka file tells you what's going on in Israel all the time. Russia just flew over Israel to basically mark where all of their major sites were for military and sensors and putting down different missiles. So people are fainting and for fear of what's going on the earth, and the powers of the heavens are shaken. So we know that's financial, political, social, and every other kind of way we're seeing all of those things happen. At that time, they will see the Son of Man. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near. When you see these things happen, you know that the kingdom of God is near. This generation will certainly not pass away until all things have happened. What generation? The World War II generation. We've already talked about the fact that they are dying off. We've got all these commemorations that we've already talked about. The warning is to us, be careful, or your hearts will be weighed down with carousing, drunkenness, and the anxieties of this life, and that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap. Why? Why does it follow us unexpectedly like a trap? Because our minds and our bodies and our energies and our resources are applied elsewhere. We're not focused on the thing, keeping our eyes fixed on Christ for his return. It's on 1,000 other things, and I have to constantly redirect myself and say, this is what I need to focus on, not all these other things that are out here distracting me, because it is so close and we don't want to be caught unawares. The signs of our nation is also this, the budding of the fig tree, which is a little picture of that below that from Ezekiel, from Isaiah, from Amos. The green is Palestinian land, the yellow is Israel's land. That was in 1946. This was the UN partition plan. This was 1967 after the Six-Day War. But they gained all of that territory, and that's Israel today. And you can see how much of the settlements is left where the Palestinians actually live. So it's generally going on. Now, I had someone talk to me recently, and they were saying, you know, Israel isn't always right in what they do, and we shouldn't be praising the Jews, and they're persecutors of within the Christadelphian Brotherhood. And I said, the point is that we're waiting for Christ's return so their hearts will be changed. No, right now, they're a very secular country. They are not people who worship the Lord strongly as we would hope. They observe, in a way, the different calendar dates and the different feasts and festivals, but they don't get the bigger picture. It's the Messianic Jews is starting to get a foothold there, but it's just sort of in its birth and infancy. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we know that the land is going to belong to the Jews. Not only this, but a much larger territory. In the signs of the times, this is the nations that are in perpetual conflict. You go from cool colors to warmer colors. So the yellow, orange, and red are areas of the world that we consider on the teetering edge of war or already engaged. You can see Canada's the only place you can really flee to where you can get away. So there you go, Matt. You got what you wanted. He was advocating for it downstairs. We can all live on a nice little glacier that's melting. All right. Next slide. So the signs of our times, men are calling evil good and good evil. From Isaiah. I think Jeremiah says it too. This is happening all the time. The real truth, the real morality that God has said is considered what now? The Grinch did hand it here. What are our views considered today? Hateful, that's a good adjective. What else? I'm sorry? Intolerant, what else? I'm sorry? Yeah, and closed-minded. They're all exactly where we are because we don't embrace what's going on in the world and approve of it. And these are just some of the headlines Amy put together. You probably can't see them very much because I changed the color, but I'm not going to read them because they're unsavory, but you can see the kinds of craziness that is going on in the world and how it is just constantly being denigrated. We are supposed to separate ourselves from all of that. You know, when Moses said, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, it wasn't a suggestion. The earth swallowed them up. This kind of nonsense is not where we belong. We need to distinguish ourselves and stay away from it. Doesn't mean we can't help them. It doesn't mean we can't talk and try to influence, but we don't tolerate it or get involved in it. This is a messy little slide, but it's not mine. We are living at the end times. This has a lot of different information on it, from Israel to the Six-Day War to the natural patterns of disaster, and also talking about Britain's exit from the EU, what Russia is up to. This was also put together by Brother Mike Steele from The Watchman. It's interesting because these patterns are, his whole point here is everything is accelerating in how fast it's happening. It's almost like drinking from a fire hose. So one of the things I'd like to warn is the love of many is waxing cold. Don't let it happen to you. Pray that it doesn't happen to you. Pray that it doesn't happen to this ecclesia. Pray that it doesn't happen to our brotherhood, because if it does happen, you're going to see a mass exodus. We need to be the opposite of this. We need our love to be getting greater, not getting colder. So it's extremely important because we're coming into this big storm, and if we don't strengthen each other in the Lord, encourage each other in the Lord, you're going to see an attrition and an erosion that will surprise even you. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So we have this downward spiral of morality. We don't want to be the judges. We don't want to be in the times where everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes and make up and justify everything we do. We either live by God's law or not. But there really is no in-between. There is no gray area. We can't come to Christ in the judgment seat and say, well, here's my excuse and rationale and justification for doing this, and this. We need to make a clean break from it, be honest with ourselves as only we can, and not do what's right in our own eyes, but to please our Father in heaven instead. So, top fears. This is one of the signs from Luke 21. This is a recent survey. So, what do people fear? The government. Top one on the left, 60%. Terrorism attacks on our nation, 41%. Inadequate funds for the future, almost 40%. Victims of terrorism, almost 40%. Gun control, dying loved ones are all 38. And then 37, economic financial collapse. There's all kinds of YouTube videos on this stuff. It's just amazing. Identity theft, 37%. Loved ones seriously ill. Why? Because they won't be able to pay for it or take care of them, 35%. Affordable Health Care Act, another 35%. So several of these are related to health. Some are related to natural disaster, crime, and economics. So we can see this is what's occupying people's mind. It's not when the Lord returns. It's they're filled with anxieties and fears, which is one of the predictions in Luke 21. So here's another crisis, the death of money. You know, the economic bubble about to burst again. It took us 10 years to recover from what happened in 2007. Now we're at 2017. It's been 10 years. You know, the real estate market has finally stabilized. The dollar is okay, I guess, but it's being propped up by who knows what. So the nations are all basically going under one by one financially, and the United States is like surging forward thinking everything's going to be fine. But the question is it? We know that there are cycles of economic collapse. They happen about every 10 years now. It used to be like the Panic of 1893, then there was another financial crisis in 1929, then there was another one in the 60s, there's another one in the 80s, then another one in 2007. So they do run in cycles, but a lot of people believe we are coming up with another one very soon. There's also a great amount of violence that's increasing on the earth. These are all headlines. Again, I'm not going to read them, but basically you've got Noah and Lot being compared with our generation. What did it say about the times of Noah? It said there was great violence in the land, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And then from Lot's time, that they were extremely evil and that they were immoral, greedy, and perverse. So if you take those two pictures of those two different worlds and you mesh them together, that's where we are today. That's the thing we've got to look for is we think that our times are just as violent as the past, but it is not. It's like being accelerated. Wars and rumors of wars. We've got all kinds of things going on. This is Damascus. This is President Assad of Syria standing with Vladimir Putin, who's propping him up, hoping that he can get his port and his military bases in Syria, which is his whole goal, to have control over the Mediterranean, to have control over the Atlantic, and to have control over the Indian Ocean. Because what Russia really has never had and has always tried to have is one thing, a warm water port. Most of their ports are under winter conditions or under ice most of the year. So Syria is a bonanza to them. This is a recent article. I just want to read part of it. It's not the whole article, from Forbes magazine. It just came out in September of this year. It says, September 30th will mark the 2-year anniversary of Moscow's intervention in Syria that saved Syrian President Bashar al-Assad from an imminent collapse, because his people were totally against him and he was financially out of money. He had no weaponry left. Assad is largely responsible for one of the worst humanitarian tragedies since World War II. Why state that? Because 15 million Syrians have been forced out of their country into Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and various other places. It's a huge humanitarian disaster, and it's continuing to go on. Today, in no small part thanks to Russian President Vladimir Putin, he has emerged in the strongest position since the massive uprising swept the country in March of 2011. Iran and its proxy, Hezbollah, have done much to prop up Assad in the last 6 months. In late spring of 2013, a Hezbollah surge kept him from falling. But in September of 2015, it was the Russian air power that saved Assad from losing ground. Putin has stood by Assad from the very beginning and protected him in multiple ways. I would say not without a price. He armed him, protected him in the UN Security Council, and sustained Syrians' military and economy. So he's protecting him with money, with weapons, with air cover, at the UN, politically, and everything else to stay in power. But the intervention was a game changer that signaled Russia's escalation into Syria. The only reason he's there is because he's already told them, we're staying. We get you back in power. You're a puppet government of Russia. You will do what we say. Today, on balance, Putin achieved virtually everything he wanted in Syria. He kept Assad in power. He entrenched Russian military presence in Syria for at least the next 49 years. A jubilee period. Very interesting. Russia's largest military presence outside of the former Soviet Union. Thus, Putin reduced the U.S. ability military in the region and assured Russian influence in one of the most strategic, important countries in the Middle East. Putin's support for Assad's ethnic cleansing campaign exacerbated massive destabilizing refugee flows into Europe. As long as Assad or someone like him remains in power, the majority of refugees will not return home. Assad's traditional woes, such as Turkish President Recep and Rogan, have come to accept Moscow's view on Assad
in every Saudi Arabia, and even in Saudi Arabia, may be shifting its position in Moscow's favor. Most importantly for Putin, he can now showcase cooperation with the West in his terms. He created a perpetuation of Russia as a great power broker and obtained international recognition for his latest ceasefire initiative in the southwest Syria that led to the establishment and de-escalation zones after Putin met with Trump in July of this year. Russian, Iran, and Turkey serve as a ceasefire guaranteers. Putin always resisted Western protection safety zones in Syria, but a Russian-led ceasefire allows him to preserve his interests in the country. So Gog, Magog, all these guys that we talked about, Gog, are all coming together just as the Bible predicted. And when is it happening? From July till now, all the stuff has been happening. So you see a complete new lineup. I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it's a grand conjunction of all the things that we were talking about. And the title of this article was what? Anybody read it? How Russia checkmated the U.S. So we're out of the picture on this. We have no power here. Be gone. The Russians have basically taken control over the whole area. So we know that Russia is in Syria. They're alarming Russian militaries. They're only 5 kilometers, 3 miles from their border. There was also the recent thing that happened at the Dome of the Rocks, the Palestinian Arab-Jewish conflict, the Dome of the Rocks and the Wailing Wall, the Western settlements, the two-state solution that is constantly very divisive, the fencing and walls that is going on all around the country. That's why Ezekiel 38 doesn't fit, because they're talking about cities of unwalled villages. The whole country is nothing but walls. Walls that are going up everywhere to protect one group from the other group. And there's tunneling going on from Egypt to Jordan to everywhere, to Syria, coming over and bringing in weapons. And the status of Jerusalem, a capital for the nation or not, that's constantly in question. So these are the signs of our times that are going on. Britain's exit from the European Union is huge. It's been over 40 years. For over 150 years, Christadelphians have believed that a political separation from Britain and Europe was inevitable. We are therefore not surprised by the people of Britain have voted to Brexit from out of the EU. The other one is the group of scientists, physicists, economics people have basically said on the doomsday clock that we have 2 minutes till midnight. And that's man's prediction of what's going on the earth, not God's. Very secular. The environmental crisis, the earth is groaning, is in Romans chapter 8. And this is what we're talking about. For the creation waits in eager expectation the reviving of the sons of God. For creation it was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, and hope that the creation itself will be set free from the bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons and for the redemption of our body. So we know since the creation there's been groans and pains, but I'm telling you these contractions are getting closer together and we're waiting for something major to happen. The signs of our time of economic crisis, this is one of the major storms going from just 1980 to 2010 and how much it has increased. So there are different colors. Storms are in purple, floods are in green, droughts are in red, geophysical events are in the orange down here at the bottom. This is a wonderful infographic. You have Hurricane Katrina, 17 inches, Superstorm Sandy, 7 inches, and that was Harvey, 51 inches. It's incredible how much rainfall. It was 51.88. It's the maximum rainfall that the United States has ever seen. It was a huge record. And we had 3 right on top of each other. We had Hurricane Harvey, then we had Irma, and then we had Maria, all of them devastating. Anybody heard of Puerto Rico, what's going on there? They still have no communications. They have 10,000 FEMA people down there trying to do something. 90% of the trees were knocked down. 90% or greater of the homes were completely destroyed. There's no electricity, no running water. It's an apocalyptic mess down there. and everybody's like, oh, I gotta go watch the game this afternoon. So, but it's just, to me, it's very important that we realize these people are suffering around the world because of what's going on the earth and how much these disasters are taking place. I'm not gonna play this video for the sake of time because I'm almost out. So, earthquakes in diverse places. The top one is Italy, before and after. This is what just happened in Mexico, and they keep getting hit. It's one right after the other. Literally, the last one was on I think it was the 32nd anniversary of the great earthquake that happened in Mexico City in 1985 that killed thousands of people. And this one happened literally on the anniversary of the last earthquake, which is pretty amazing. These are central and eastern earthquakes from 73 to now. And you can see with all the fracking that's going on in Oklahoma, we've caused that to be the #1 state for seismic activity in the United States. So that's a pretty amazing feat. We also have some of the worst firestorms we have seen in many years. We know from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7, but for the same word, the heavens and the earth that now exist are stored up for fire, being kept until the day of judgment and the destruction of ungodly men. So this year was proclaimed the deadliest year for fires across Tennessee, California, Texas, and the West. Right now, we've got 75 wildfires in the West with over 3 million acres burned. So each year keeps getting worse as far as all this is going on. The pollution that is continuing to go on from China to other different industrial nations. These are all the different species that are gradually becoming extinct. We also have towns that used to be that are changing. This is from 1880 to 2000, the global temperature change, but it's in Celsius, which is a little more than our Fahrenheit. And you can see how much that's grown. This house was in Maryland. The whole island and its 600 inhabitants that used to be there are gone. The house collapsed in 2010 and it isn't there anymore. So real communities are going away, and about 85% of the world's population lives near water in some way or form. So we can see this is going to have a great effect on mankind when the ocean levels continue to increase. The signs of the times, the glaciers are melting and breaking off. There's a chart about it. We have pictures of it going on. We're seeing how much it's increased just from 1960 to 2010 with the temperatures and the melting of the glaciers. This is showing you actual recession from 1851 to today, or 2003. The map up there, all the red is where the glaciers are receding. The blue is where they're growing. So you can see a big difference there. This is the gradual erosion, melting of another big glacier. So we also have the sea levels rising. I won't read all of this. You're well familiar with it, but it's continuing to rise and cause great damage to property and to people, because whenever you have this rise, whenever you have a hurricane, you have storm surge on top of high tides rolling in and just covering, like Florida, for instance. 2-3 weeks after the storm left, they're still under 10 feet of water. I mean, it's just incredible that these things don't recede as they should. This is another video I don't have time for, but only about I've heard that basically about 1 to 2% of the total of our seas, ocean-wise, is actually marina environments or coral reefs, but they are gradually dying out as well. There's predictions that the coral reefs could be gone as early as 30 years from now. Signs of the times of environmental crisis. This is the recent, to the right is the recent earthquake, a tsunami in Japan. This is flooding from the hurricane, other things. So we can see it's all around us. We've had the signs of the times with the different blood moons. People say, well, nothing happened, so it was meaningless. It was a pile of nothing. But what it is a warning instead of an actual event taking place. We will see signs in the sun, moon, and stars, as we've seen from many different things. We've just had a pretty amazing solar eclipse across the entire United States. I won't get into that one, we don't have time. But basically, sun, moon, and stars darkening, the earthquakes that happened, and also the seas roaring. And all these are recorded in several different scriptures from Matthew, Luke, Revelations, and Joel. And we'll stop there for today, but thank you for your attention.